Partnership on Environment webinar series on public participation in the EIA process, scoping to evaluation. Those of you who participated in the first of these webinars would recall that we focused on some of the activities prior to the EIA process and also during the monitoring and implementation stages. So today we're going to focus very much on public participation in the EIA process itself. And to introduce the topic, we have one of the leading environmental lawyers in Asia and the Pacific, Matthew Baird, who will do the presentations. Welcome Matthew Baird, and have a listen to what he has to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter. And so we will get straight into it and focus on public participation in the EIA process from scoping to evaluation. So today I'm going to look at sort of 5 particular issues, and hopefully the presentation will be 25 minutes, and that will give us some opportunities for some questions at the end. But I always like to review the key principles of environment impact assessment, because I'm very convinced that when we understand these key principles, it makes it easier to apply them. Then I want to look at the public participation spectrum, which is a spectrum that's been developed by the Association for Public Participation. That is an international association that looks about specifically on public participation, not just in EIA, but how to effectively engage communities, and they've got some great resources. Then I want to identify the key steps in the EIA process, and part of this is the work that we've done as part of the Regional Technical Working Group on Environment Impact Assessment, organised by Mekong Partnership for the Environment and PACT and AECEN, and then go through a couple of examples on the scoping or public participation in scoping and evaluation as identified by 2 EIA reports. And then finally, lessons to be learnt from some of the experiences that I've had with environment impact assessment, but also some of the experiences that a lot of the literature has identified. So the key principles of EIA, and again I always like to reiterate that there is an aim for environmental impact assessment. It is this idea of promoting sustainable development. And sustainable development, as we've identified partly over the last 25 years as the concept was developed leading up to the 1992 Rio Convention. Sustainable development is development that improves the total quality of life both now and in the future in a way that maintains the ecological processes on which life depends. And this definition understands that we are talking about proposals that will have some impact, some development that will have an impact. And within the context of EIA, we are going to look at how that is assessed, looking at the impacts of that development both now and in the future, and making sure that whatever development occurs, it has to maintain those ecological processes on which life depends. And that may be on a community level, it may be on a country level. And when we talk about issues of climate change, for example, and emissions from particular industries, air pollutants and water pollutants, it could even be national, regional and global in terms of that impact. So environment impact assessment itself is a process, and it's of identifying, predicting, evaluating and mitigating the biophysical, the social and other relevant effects of proposed projects and physical activities prior to major decisions and commitments being made. And I've highlighted the 2 things. One is that it's a process. So it begins usually when someone has the idea of a project, and that may simply be a concept. There may be no project that's developed, so it might even start right from that beginning. And it's also done prior. So a key element of EIA is that we're meant to have done this assessment before the beginnings, before the development occurs, before the clearing of the land happens, and certainly before the proposal is operated. But it is a question that it is a process, and one of the key areas that we look at is the idea of public participation, beginning with that initial project development and continuing right up to the monitoring evaluation. And the last webinar, Peter talked a lot about the involvement of the community in that monitoring and evaluation phase when the project is up and running. What we're going to focus on today is the identification and involvement of the community before that approval happens. And we know, of course, that the consequences of failing to protect the environment are always significant, and this is the industrial north of China. So we've identified 7 key principles of environment impact assessment, and these have been developed by a number of people and distilled over the last few years with the work that PAC and AECEN have been doing within this Mekong Partnership for the Environment. We talk about a legally established, clear and effective process, the proponent bearing the cost of the application and assessment, the genuine and meaningful public participation at all steps of the process, access to information by civil society and government, best available information, open and evidence-based decision-making, and effective monitoring, compliance and enforcement. So the 2 issues that we really want to look at now are the idea of this genuine and meaningful public participation and access to information. And access to information is important because participation is always predicated on the information that is provided to the community and to those who might be affected by the project. Now, this is a typical of the EIA process, certainly within the Mekong countries and within ASEAN itself, that we have a screening process that identifies at an initial stage what level of assessment a project might have, whether a project is going to have any impact, any significant impact. If not, it may require no formal environmental assessment apart from some permits and other permitting processes. Then there is the initial environmental evaluation, which are for projects that may have some impact that could be modified or mitigated through environmental management plans. And then there are the projects that are likely to have a significant impact on the environment. And that's the projects that usually require environmental impact assessment. And that has a process that goes through from the scoping phase, developing of terms of reference for the environment impact assessment, then the preparation of the environmental impact assessment report, the preparation of environmental management plans, the submission of those to the government, to the relevant ministry, where that would be assessed and reviewed, compared to existing standards, compared to best available technology and techniques. And as part of that process, there should be some consultation. The recommendation is that either the EIA is approved, subject to conditions, or it's rejected. Most occasions we're dealing with processes and projects that will be approved subject to conditions. So I then wanted to look at the idea of the public participation, and one of the key elements and key rationales for public participation is that it does produce better decision by government. And in 1992 at the Rio conference, the Rio Declaration put in place certain principles, one of which, Principle 10, clearly identified the role of the community and concerned citizens and how they should be involved in environmental impact assessment. And so Principle 10 is identified because it talked not only about environmental issues best being handled by participation of all concerned citizens, but it also talked about individuals having appropriate access to information concerning the environment. That could include hazardous materials and other activities, and the opportunity to participate in decision-making processes. So it talked about the three key elements that were later followed up in the Aarhus Convention in Europe: public participation, access to information, and then the access to effective judicial remedies or other proceedings so that these rights could be enforced. Most countries have enacted environment impact assessment legislation that provides for public participation and access to information. Sometimes the access to remedies and access to justice is not there in the EIA legislation. Sometimes it is an internal right of review. Sometimes it is a more formal opportunity to appeal to the courts. But certainly these three things, the public participation, access to information, and access to effective remedy, really underpin the ideas behind public participation in environmental impact assessment. So one of the things that has been developed and has become quite influential is the idea of the spectrum of public participation. And this has been developed by the International Association for Public Participation, and recognises that there are various levels. And one of the key elements that we have to think about in environmental impact assessment, and indeed the process, is at what stage of the process does the particular level of public participation occur. The public participation spectrum starts at the informed, which is really to provide information. It's about giving information to the community, but it's not necessarily about taking on board any thoughts or ideas. Then there is the next level of consultation, where the process, whether it's the EIA consultant or the decision maker, wants to actually hear back from the community. In the initial stages, it could be, what are their concerns? What are their issues? What is the potential impact? What knowledge do they have about the local community and the environment? This consultation is about listening and acknowledging the concerns, but it doesn't go as far as the next step, which is the involve. And this is where we look to work directly with the community, and not only to inform them and to consult with them, but to actually set up systems and respond to those concerns to make sure, and part of the phrase here is consistently understood and considered. So it's an ongoing process of actively working with the community. It might be a number of communities, it might be NGOs, to make sure that those concerns are genuinely addressed and responded to. The next two levels of collaborate and empower are where the community becomes essentially part of the decision-making process. So they are truly partnered with the EIA consultant or the project proponent in making sure and shaping the project. And finally, the empowering level is where the community is given the ability to actually approve or refuse a project. Now, in the EIA systems around the world, empowerment is very rare. In theory, communities are given an opportunity, an empowerment opportunity, if they are Indigenous communities under free, prior, informed consent. But at present, there are only 3 jurisdictions that recognise free, prior, informed consent, which would give the power of Indigenous communities the right to approve or reject proposals over their land. But most of the EIA process in the ASEAN region focuses on the first 3 levels of inform, consult, and involve. And one of the things that I think is very important is to work out ways and mechanisms to maximise those goals of inform and consult and involve. So in terms of the spectrum, this slide shows at the bottom some examples of techniques for each of those levels of participation. So to inform can be fact sheets, websites, open houses where a document is kept at a particular work location or a particular site, and people can go and see and read the information. Consultation can be further: surveys, meetings, writing, taking notes, getting comment. The involving, which we see as a quite an optimal outcome in certain respects, is the idea of having further workshops, really sitting down with the community, working out those key issues and resolving them, meeting those needs and those expectations. Collaboration can include the idea of advisory committees. Part of the idea that Peter mentioned in the last webinar about citizen committees helping or working on monitoring and compliance could be some form of collaboration once projects are up and running, and they can be very, very beneficial. And then the empowerment could be juries, ballots and delegated decisions, where the government gives the power to the community to make the decision. I should say that that is an exceptionally rare occurrence. Invariably, governments, while they can move to involving and consulting with the community, ultimately preserve the right to make the decisions themselves. So very briefly, with the key steps in the EIA process, one of the questions about public participation is who, when and how. These are key questions. And we say, who can be involved? Well, anyone. It's not, you don't have to be a citizen, you don't even have to be a local resident. You can be someone who is genuinely concerned. Most of my experience in Australia has been with NGOs that might be national NGOs, or they might be local NGOs, or they might be international NGOs that have particular experience. My view is always that anyone who wants to participate or be involved should be entitled to do so. So we say that people should have the right to the relevant information, and indeed part of that idea of being able to get the information is then they have an ability to make submissions on the proposal and the EIA reports, both to the EIA consultant as part of the process, but also when the EIA report is submitted to the government and being reviewed, there should be an opportunity for those concerned individuals, project affected people and stakeholders to then make submissions to the government. And ultimately, one of the aspects of public participation is the need for formal consultation with local communities, potentially affected people, but also local governments, local authorities, other concerned organisations, civil society, and other government decisions. One of the things that I found over the last 5 years working within Asia is that often governments don't necessarily consult with other government ministries, and so part of the EIA process is also to involve other ministries to get their expertise and comments. One of the issues that we work about in terms of public participation and the EIA process is that once the screening and we have here the scoping stage, you then lead to investigations and reporting, the preparation and the submission of the EIA report, and then the assessment to the relevant government ministry. I've highlighted in yellow 3 areas where there is opportunities for public participation and I think certainly at the scoping stage, there is an opportunity for the project proponent to actually, and the EIA consultant, to take the initial project to the communities and the affected communities and start the public participation process at that point. In addition, when they're then doing the investigations and the reporting, and that can take a short time or a long time depending on the project, there should be further opportunities for public participation. And then once the government and the EIA unit is assessing the project, that is also an opportunity where the government can, and the ministry can hold its own meeting, not necessarily to test whether the people accept the project, but it's testing whether or not their concerns have been adequately reflected in the EIA and the proposals and the environment management plans and mitigation plans proposed by the project proponent. Now, there are a number of steps in the EIA process. Some of these steps will be longer than the others. Some of these steps may involve public participation. For us, we're going to look from this scoping phase to the conducting EIA assessment and the review of the EIA report. They're all opportunities where there are 3 distinct opportunities for public participation. So one of the lessons that we've learned is there is a great need for early public participation, and that involving the community at the earliest stage can make the best results, both for the public participation process, but they can also show that the project can be designed and in a way that can take into account those concerns of the community. And it's certainly much easier if the community are involved from this beginning, from the scoping phase where these terms of reference are developed, and those terms of reference are then used to write the EIA. And so when the scoping phase happens, if the EIA consultant or the project proponent meets with the community and can identify key issues, whether they're livelihood issues, environmental issues, particular issues related to water or energy or traffic or transport, needs of the community to develop what are potentially project commitments, all of these things, if they're identified early in the proposal and the project, then the project can be developed with those in mind. And it's much easier to develop a project and design a project, including layout of the particular structures, when you have a better understanding of those community needs, the community layout. And one of the simple issues is, for example, traffic. By engaging with the community early, one could identify schools, temples, churches, mosques, residential locations, all of those things that are most likely to be impacted by your traffic. And then you can design your road access and your road layout and your traffic management scheme recognizing those. So you wouldn't have the trucks from a large mine running past a school because of the potential conflict. And so involving the community at that early stage gives you the options for then the design of the project. Part of the scoping phase is to identify the terms of reference. Usually the terms of reference are approved of by the relevant ministry, the EIA department, and then the project proponent and the EIA consultant will conduct their environmental impact assessment in accordance with the terms of reference. So that's why it is important that at the scoping stage we do get community involvement to identify those issues that should be reflected in the terms of reference. One of the key issues in most legislation in the region is that there are specific requirements that the EIA reports must comprehensively address their public participation. Usually there will have to be a public participation report included in the EIA that is submitted to the EIA unit, and that should include the methodology, the summary of activities. It should also talk about what were the results, including the responses to submissions, how the project proponent has responded to concerns and issues raised. So for example, in terms of the traffic, if the project proponent has decided that nevertheless the traffic road will run past the school, it needs to be said whether this is something that the community has accepted or whether they've proposed alternatives, and why the project proponent is going to put the road by the school rather than build another access road. And again, once these reports have been prepared and submitted to the relevant EIA unit of the ministry, the decision made by the government on the EIA, whether to approve the environmental impact assessment report and the environmental management plans, should be based on those comments received, including public submission. And so that's why it is very important for, at that evaluation stage, for the ministry to conduct its own public consultation with the project affected people. And again, if it's a large project, that might take a number of meetings over a number of weeks. They're the things that enable the EIA unit to ensure that the community had been effectively engaged. And usually this is where, right at the end, when the project proponent's expecting to get some project approval, that if the community hasn't been consulted, this is where these issues will be raised, and often raised for the first time, and the EIA unit will then require the project proponent to re-evaluate and reassess the project, and that can be very expensive, very time-consuming, and not a good outcome. Now, I don't want to go into the monitoring and compliance. Peter's mentioned that in the last email. So very briefly, just to give you two examples, I wanted to raise the Thilawa SEZ, which is south of Yangon City in Myanmar. The Thilawa Special Economic Zone is a large development with some commitment from JICA and other international organisations to develop a very large industrial facility. They undertook an EIA for Stage A, which was part of a smaller segment south of or contained within the 2,400 hectare Thilawa SEZ. So the Stage 1 was a 400 hectare centre of the Thilawa SEZ, and the Special Economic Zone is now up and running, and there are a number of companies who have invested. So this was the EIA that was done and put on some public exhibition back in 2012, 2013. And I just wanted to focus on the public participation that was contained within the EIA for the Special Economic Zone. And it did have a list and a chapter identifying the stakeholder meetings. It did attach comments and a transcript of the meetings and the questions that were asked. And so superficially it looked as if the project proponent had done some stakeholder consultations in relation to the two villages that were adjacent to the SEZ. So as it says here, concerned and relevant participation for the stakeholder meetings were identified to obtain various opinions and to encourage the exchange of information and discussion. So it looked as if quite clearly they had done some investigation of who might be affected and took trouble to identify them. So then there were two meetings, one in April, an introduction, a discussion of the terms of reference for the environmental survey, and then a second meeting in August, which was a result of the field survey and an explanation of the environmental management plan. So superficially, from my perspective, that looks great. They've got two meetings, one to inform, and then another later when they've got some information to make further information, present further information, and explain to the community. It should be noted that although it says it encouraged the exchange of information, it's not quite clear whether they were seeking to consult with the community or merely to inform the community. Then when one examined the public participation processes, one realised that although there were two meetings, one in April and one in August, they were in different locations. One was in the Tan Nguyen Township, which was the 8th of April meeting. The August 2013 meeting was in the Jiaopan Township, and these are the two townships that surround, if you like, the 400 hectare Special Economic Zone. And so when I see this, I see that 31 people attended the first stakeholder meeting. And I thought, well, 31 people, maybe that's not such a bad number of people. I then looked at the 23rd August and I saw also there were 31 people. But then I also noticed it was a different township. So clearly it wasn't a question of repeating the information. It was two separate meetings, both of which had two different purposes. I then, looking closer at the people who were present, one looked down the types of organisations and saw that there were quite a number of representatives from the township but these were official representatives, people from the Myanmar Economic Bank, the Housing Board, Minister, the Supporting Committee, the mass media, so there were 2 members of the media, 8 from Resource and Environment Myanmar, they're the consultant, the Myanmar Environment Institute, again another consulting organisation, and local staff of the study team. So I was trying to see whether or not there were any actual people there as opposed to government people or other representatives. And then I went to the next meeting, and again, working down through the list, I saw that there were people from the Ministry of Environment, from MOCAF. There were some also from administration offices. There was again 3 mass media, 8 members of the consultation, and here at point 16, 1 local citizen. So of those 62 people, only 1 person in those 2 meetings was identified as being a local person. And as I say, whether that constitutes public participation, I think not. It was then I started to get a little bit concerned about this level of public participation. And so I then identified that the Tan Nguyen Township has approximately 210,000 people. The Jalkan Township has approximately 160,000 people. So out of a total of 370,000 people, I initially identified 4 potential local community members who attended the 2 workshops. It might only be 1, depending on how you sort of characterise. And yet it's clear from the EIA that livelihood issues, agriculture, fisheries, all these things were going to be affected. That was what those 2 communities made most of their money from, agriculture and fishing, and given that the SEZ went and extended up until the river and was going to include potentially a port, these had huge impacts and huge potential impacts for those communities. Again, the same thing can be said about traffic. When you can see that the traffic things, they go through most of the communities, again, significant issues, clearly a lack of public participation and consultation. And I wanted to contrast that with another example of a gold mine assessment that took place in northern New South Wales. And I use this a lot because this EIA company has obviously done a lot of mining, and acting on behalf of the project proponent, this assessment done in 2011 was quite significant, and I use it as a good example of an EIA. It was for an underground and open cut gold mine, and under the New South Wales law, there are these Director General's requirements which are part of the terms of reference, if you like, and so they fulfill a bit of the scoping development of terms of reference. And this project was for a gold mine for up to 9 years, approximately 1 million tonnes of gold ore a year, including transportation, processing, and a large number of potential impacts. One of the issues contained in the Director General's term requirements was here under consultation, and it identified the need for an appropriate level of consultation with relevant local, state or Commonwealth government authorities, service providers, community groups or affected landholders, with various specific requirements for particular departments. And as it says down the bottom, both the consultation process and the issues raised during this consultation process must be described in the environmental assessment. And within the report, located in red, and it says the mine site is quite far away from the large towns of Dubbo and the smaller town of Narromine. It is actually adjacent to the small village of Tomingley, which is the hatched area in purple. But you can see from this layout of the plan, the layout of the proposed mine. And again, this is one of those things that for me I find very valuable, is having layouts and having plans. Part of the issues you can see here with this map of the area that was going to be affected by the mine is also how close it is to that village of Tomingley. And yet the mine is certainly developed in a way that aim to minimise the potential impacts on that village. Again, within the EIA, there was this identification of traffic and project hours of operation. So the mine was going to operate 24 hours a day, blasting operations, which were going to be the most activity that had the most impact, from 9 AM to 5 PM. But it was a 24-hour-a-day operation. And so that required the project proponent to ensure that noise and traffic was not going to significantly impact the village of Tomingley. So in terms of the consultation, and this is just the executive summary, there was not only individual discussions with landowners and residents of Tomingley and surrounding areas, there were also 2 community meetings, and there was also the regular consultation with various government agencies. So even for a small community of Tomingley, this EIA consultant conducted 2 meetings. Compare that to the Special Economic Zone, where there are also 2 meetings, but again, different locations and with very limited community participation. Within the process of information, it also disclosed how many full-time equivalent positions would be developed, so that there was some understanding of what the impact it might be on the local community. Would these people interact with the local village? Would there be any problems or any concerns? It's one of those key issues, I think, for any major project within this region, that large-scale projects do have some community impacts from workers who are often brought in from different regions or even externally. One of the other things that they did within the Tomingley EIA is that they had extensive consultation with Aboriginal communities, with the Indigenous community. And I've listed this here because it is quite important to see just how many meetings they had with Indigenous communities. There are a number of Indigenous local Aboriginal land councils that had an interest. There are a number of the Council of Elders that had an interest. There were individuals that had an interest. All of these people were consulted, and you can see down the bottom the series of meetings about Aboriginal site management issues, a range of one-to-one and community meetings with a number of the Wiradjuri community, and there are sort of 6 or 7 meetings. And so this seems to be a very extensive period of consultation. It took a number of months, in July, August, February, September, even leading up to meetings after the EIA had been completed and lodged in February 2011. Again, this highlights the fact that the preparation of an environmental impact assessment can take 1 or 2 years if done properly. EIAs are not done quickly, or shouldn't be done quickly, because you lose that opportunity to identify the issues and make proper assessments. But one of the things I wanted to point out here is that if you see the extensive public communication, public participation with the Indigenous community, people then ask, well, how many people, Indigenous community, have to be relocated because of this mine? And the answer was none. There was actually no Aboriginal or Indigenous community that were living on these properties. But because we recognise the importance of cultural and spiritual association of Indigenous people to land, and this land had in times past been associated or been occupied thousands of years ago by these Indigenous communities, they were effectively and adequately consulted to understand if there had been any issues, what were those issues, and if the mine was going to have an impact, did they need to redesign the mine, relocate the mine to avoid interfered cultural or spiritual impacts. So this is an example of an extensive consultation for an issue that didn't even require any resettlement. The communities were not present on the land. There were no specific artefacts. There was no temples. There were no religious sites. But it was important for that to be identified and disclosed during the EIA process. The Tomingley mine was approved or recommended for approval and approved. There was no objections from the local community, no objections from the local government authority. and it's an example, I think, of how a good public participation process can ensure that adequate conditions are imposed. Obviously, blasting, noise, traffic, the use of chemicals for the mining process or the processing of the gold, these were all important issues, but once they'd been resolved through conditions, then the impact was going to be within appropriate levels. So just in conclusion, before we get on to some questions and discussion, I just wanted to identify part of the guidelines on public participation that are being developed, and part of the research that led into the preparation of these draft regional guidelines is an understanding that scoping, although it might be required, is not always used. There's not always a development of terms of reference prior to people or EIA consultants undertaking their EIA assessment. Sometimes guidelines are not clear, they can be very complex, they can also not be in the local language, and that makes it very difficult to discuss with affected communities exactly what might be happening. It's also clear that specific requirements for information are not generally clear, so that people understand what information they should have available at what time. Many countries allow the EIA, the full EIA, to become a public document, but only after the project is approved. And that makes it very difficult for people to comment on those projects. The scoping report, the terms of reference, they should also be public documents and clearly defined as public documents so that everyone understands those issues and can talk about those issues right at the earlier start of the process. So one of the things that we are looking at, and in particular for public participation, some of the key issues, is timing of public participation. It is generally accepted by EIA consultants and in the academic literature that the earliest possible time is the best. The earlier the participation starts, the better for the project and the better for the community. Another issue is what information is to be made available to the public and when. A third issue is the type and number of meetings to be held. Should you have one meeting, two meetings? Should you have meetings with women as well as involving young people and old people? How many meetings just the local community, or should you have a number of community meetings? The reporting requirements. That's also an important issue, how you have to report on the feedback from meetings, and ultimately issues about monitoring and compliance, how the community should be involved in community grievance mechanisms. And again, that depends on projects. Large-scale projects will have ongoing management issues, and it's very important that the community is involved in that. But in terms of the scoping, in terms of the evaluation or the preparation of the EIA report and the evaluation, these are some of those key issues. Timing, and that's why we always recommend that getting the community involved at scoping can actually make such a large difference. Not only is the identification of the appropriate stakeholders and project affected people, but also the identification of the issues and making it much easier for the project proponent and the EIA consultant to address those issues at the beginning. And then one of the things that I think is very important is that clarity of information, making it quite clear what documentation needs to be provided to the community. It can't just be a press release saying we're going to build a wonderful mine. It needs to be more information so that the community understand the location of the project, what is actually going to happen, the hours of operation, how many people are going to be employed, where they be housed, water, sewerage, waste treatment, all these things. And of course, not only is the information important, but how it is presented. If an environment impact assessment report is 3,000 pages long, full of scientific information, local communities are not going to have the ability to assess that and digest that. That also means we have to ensure that local communities as well as NGOs can work together and often work with the project proponent or the EIA consultant so that we can genuinely understand those key issues. So the importance of public participation has also been part of a number of workshops and assessment. I just wanted to highlight the IGES work. They did a 6-country study they presented last year. There's some excellent presentations on the internet under the IGES website, but it shows that there's a genuine lack of, a genuine concern about public participation, and it's not just in the ASEAN countries, in Japan and Korea, China, Australia, America and Europe. There's still work being done on how to effectively engage the community at the earliest possible stage to produce the best possible result. So thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to any of your questions. Over to you, Peter.
Okay. We have some written questions, and can Matthew see them, or I should read them out?
I've got a question here about, would like to know why public participation should not or cannot be incorporated somehow into the assessment step as an oversight component. And with this, I'm assuming that the assessment step is the step where the relevant environment impact assessment unit is assessing the EIA report. It is interesting that in Thailand, they do have an expert review committee composed of international and national experts who do review the EIA, and they are the ones that do a technical review, if you like, of the EIA. In Myanmar, they have established an EIA report review body that, in theory, under the EIA procedures, could include representatives from universities and NGOs. In Indonesia, their UMDAL assessment unit also has the capacity for NGOs to be part of the assessment unit that recommends whether or not the EIA report should be approved. So it is possible to have the representatives of the community as part of that process. How you can actually further develop public participation in that technical assessment may be difficult, which is why there is always that requirement for the EIA unit to at least conduct one or more public participation meetings to test whether or not those communities have had their concerns adequately addressed in the EIA report. So I've got another question. What type of meeting is relevant if there is much information related to scientific information? How about monitoring if there are scientific impacts? So I think very much the issue of presenting technical and scientific data to the community is one that no one really has been able to adequately address. I think it is one of the things that from a project proponent perspective, they should encourage their EIA consultants to bring along experts who can essentially distill the issue for the community. Sometimes the technical issues are much more relevant to the impact that they're going to produce or try and avoid, such as the processes. People may not understand the science, but they want to know what the pollution that's being emitted, what harm it could do, what's the likely impacts. And sometimes project proponents are reluctant to talk about the impacts that their pollution might have. But at the same time, that's also an opportunity then for communities to work with local NGOs or even international NGOs so that those NGOs can help explain the impact. One of the biggest concerns that project proponents have is the fear that communities, because they don't understand something, will oppose it. And it's a genuine fear, but it's also a very clear way of trying to resolve that is being upfront and explain as best as possible the impacts of your proposals or of the emissions to the community. It then will require some discussion, and the community ultimately might still feel concerned about some of these impacts. But as long as their concerns have been recorded and taken into account and addressed, then the technical review can make sure that that's been done. But in terms of the type of meeting, It could be a meeting in a local community with some charts or graphs. It could be in the local town hall with a more formal presentation. Partly it depends on the type of community that might be affected. If it is going to be a factory in an urban area, often you can have some discussions there. But one of the other things is the need to be responsive, and the key is to take into account the community concerns and to make it clear that you've tried to address them. The worst thing that happens is people just choosing not to address an issue, and we've seen it many times with everything from coal-fired power stations to nuclear power plants to plants that produce waste. They just try not to address the issue, and that's not the right way of doing it. So I've got a question, for example, about public participation for private entities' endeavours. Again, with environment impact assessment within the region, the level of scoping and project EIA assessment and preparation, EIA preparation, that is for projects that are both private and public. And when someone suggests that they can have a development on their land without having to consult the community, I'm not sure that that's correct. If you're likely to have an impact outside someone's land, if you're running a sort of an intensive pig farm, for example, or an intensive agricultural establishment, most of these projects would require some form of approval, whether it's a license, a pollution control license, or even in some form of EIA or initial environmental evaluation. Those types of projects all then should require some form of consultation with the community to identify those issues and identify the problems and try and develop an environment management plan. It's very rare that anyone would be able to, these days, establish a particular enterprise without trying some form of environmental assessment. And for example, in Thailand, because they have the requirement for health impact assessment, if there's a proposal likely to have an impact on human health, you even need to do a specific form of assessment on health. In other jurisdictions, health is one of the issues that would be considered under the environment impact assessment report. And the final question that I've got here is about, sorry, I've got two more. One is about fast-tracking investments. And this is one of these big problems that we have at the moment. Although we have EIA laws, we often have governments that think that the EIA laws are going to impact on foreign investment, and certainly large-scale foreign investment. In Thailand, we've seen the provisions of some projects exempted now from planning controls, although in theory, under the Thai courts have identified that participation in projects that might impact on communities is now a fundamental right of Thais. One of the things we always have to do is make it quite clear that public participation is an integral part of the EIA process, and that environment impact assessment process is recognised and adopted by all countries in the region through their legislation. So when governments say they're going to fast-track projects, the key thing is to say, okay, if you want to make these projects approved quickly, we still need to ensure that the public participation process happens right at the beginning, so you can clearly identify those issues that need to be addressed. I also have a question about accessing information and social media platform, and will that change the way the public can access EIA information, data, results? Do I see it happening in Australia, US or Europe? And are there any movement of this kind in Asia? I mean, I certainly have seen that social media, particular projects can be very, very powerful because it enables people to connect as a community. I mean, especially Facebook in Thailand, on projects such as stop coal-fired power stations or stop particular things. The key thing about technology and access to information, of course, is that you have to have the information that's there that can be put publicly available. And the second is that you have to have a community that's connected through the internet or elsewhere. But often one of the things using information technology is the idea of being able to have some people connect can access things on the internet and the web, who can then use that information to then go out into the communities. And one organisation I know in Myanmar called EcoDev has been doing that. Once they get the information, they then also start to do a community EIA, which is almost like a parallel EIA, and it's something that's also been looked at in Thailand, where the communities say, well, we like your EIA process is driven by the project proponent and the EIA consultant. We're going to try and do our own community EIA to identify the issues that we will then submit to government. And that can use very, very much the role of technology. Indonesia in particular uses a lot of apps where people can look at information about their project. Thailand has an EIA app as well. Again, one of the problems is you can't really use a phone app to download or look at a 3,000 page or 1,000 page environmental impact assessment report. So part of that is also ensuring that there are opportunities for the information to be in a form that people can access easily and digest. I also know of the Open Development Mekong platform, and they've started to put as much information on the internet as possible. Again, that allows individuals and NGOs to access those project-specific EIAs. But once again, the problem that we do find at the moment is the difficulty in governments disclosing the EIAs or the draft EIAs, the consultants being required to put that on the internet before it is submitted to government, so as at the earliest possible stage, and also what information that companies and projects are prepared to provide to the local communities. Certainly technology really opens up that possibility, and I always access the New South Wales planning website to show governments exactly how much information is available on the project. And so that Tumingli EIA, everything is available on the internet, from all the detailed documents to the executive summaries, to the conditions of approval, and so that's also available and anyone can download. And I downloaded in Cambodia, I downloaded in Myanmar to show all those things. And so another question I've got here is about the level of public participation in each step of the process. And I think that's a very good question, because within that EIA spectrum, public participation spectrum, from inform to consult leading up to empower, each step I think does have different levels. So, for example, at the screening stage, which in Cambodia the department does conduct a meeting on site with the project proponent and affected people, that's mostly to inform. The scoping stage is where you start to consult. The preparation of the environmental impact assessment report by the EIA consultant is really when you start to involve the community, and a good consultant hopefully can move that forward to collaborate with the community to identify solutions. A difficult issue is, of course, where the community objects to the proposal and doesn't want to participate in the EIA at all. They don't want to participate because they think that gives some approval to the process. My view, based on my experience and my advice to communities, is always that participation is valuable, and it's a valuable right that should be exercised, and you should try and make a project better. At all times you can still say and make it quite clear that you don't support the project because it has too many impacts, even if all these things are taken into account, and could be based on compensation or livelihood issues, environmental impact, social impact. But participating means that at least the project proponent has to address those issues. One thing I'm always focused on is I always say to EIA consultants and to the government, I'm never concerned if the project proponent says 80% of the community supports this project. I always say that that's irrelevant. because it's always a question of who you consult and how you get those figures. The most important thing is whether those community concerns have been adequately addressed. And if not, then the project proponent has to explain why they haven't been addressed. The community should always then be given that opportunity of explaining whether they're satisfied with these things, or if they've still got concerns, or if they still do just object to the project itself. And that's then something that the government has to make the decision, and balancing up all those issues, working out what is the most sustainable development option. So they're all the written questions that I've had, and I thank you very, very much for those questions. And Peter, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. There was actually one additional question from the NGO Forum on Cambodia, which you may not have seen. It basically is saying, regarding public participation, what percentage would be good enough to represent the whole community in theory? Actually, there are many cases in Cambodia that the investment project claimed they'd involved the community in EIA development, but in most cases, very few people had actually been involved. Based on your saying there are 5 types of public participation: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. In case you're missing 1 or 2 of them, could we count that as full public participation in the EIA process? And how do you deal with the low level of involvement, perhaps only informing rather than consulting or involving?
And I think that's the difficulty with when the project proponent or the EIA consultant prepares a report to say, you know, the community support this project. They think it's great, because my experience is always that there are some people who will not agree to a project, and they should always be entitled to have their say. And so unless the community is the one that's making the decision, they're empowered, which doesn't happen here. Then it doesn't matter that 70% supported or 60% supported or 50% supported. What you're really after is those issues, which also means that if a project proponent has just informed some members of the community or even consulted with some members of the community, like in that Thilawa example, there were 390,000 people surrounding this major development, and even if all those people were community people, there were 62 people that were consulted. That just wasn't enough as part of the process, because you couldn't really say that you had involved the community if there was, you know, less than 4 people from the community who had participated in these workshops. And so from my perspective, in terms of the idea of claims that the community has been effectively consulted, it's more that the EIA consultant needs to include those details. You know, how many people live in the area, how many households, you know, did participate, what are the forms of the attendance forms and the like, you know, and photos. I saw one photo, for example, of you know, 2 village people being consulted about a development project. Surrounding those 2 village people are 10 members of in uniform, and, you know, a government. So to my mind, that sort of says, well, I'm not quite sure if that's a good consultation if people are surrounded by, you know, officials, and if the officials and the project proponent outnumber the local community. So I always think very much that we have to also try and persuade the consultants to say, not go down this path of saying we've consulted X percentage of the community, but we've consulted this number of the community and we've got these issues and we've responded to those issues, which also then requires this testing of that through the evaluation by the relevant EIA unit where those things have to be tested, and that is also where the community can say, well, we were consulted, but some of us weren't happy with that level of consultation.
Can I?
Yeah.
Right. Matthew, there's one further question that came in while you were speaking from the Ministry of Health in Malaysia, which says that most EIA studies are driven by law and by regulations. Can the public request for an EIA to be conducted? What would be the possibility of people abusing the process if they were allowed to request for an EIA? And how should government agencies address such a request with the possibility of the public abusing the process if they're allowed to request for an EIA to be conducted?
I think that's a very, very interesting and exciting question. And I always feel, I mean, most EIA legislation is written so that even if there is a screening list, so it lists particular types of activities that would require an environmental impact assessment or an initial environmental evaluation, often there is a capacity for the relevant EIA department or health department that if a project is likely to significantly affect the environment, which is the usual terminology, likely to significantly affect the environment, then it should undertake some form of environmental impact assessment or environmental assessment. So I think it's on that basis that communities should be able to require an environmental impact assessment to be considered by the relevant EIA unit, and then the project proponent required to undertake those studies. And partly it's because my experience is mostly that the community don't abuse that ability because they're genuinely concerned about the potential impact. They might be genuinely concerned because of the lack of information that's available, and so an environmental assessment process is a way that that information can come out into the public and that those concerns can be addressed. And I have a very strong view that even though communities may not always like projects, at the very least, engaging the community can always make a project better. Because governments keep to themselves the capacity to approve the EIA report and to allow or disallow the project, having the community involved helps them fulfill their rights as members of the community and the citizens. And fulfilling your right to participate as recognised both by the Rio Declaration and national laws is part of your obligation as a citizen, and that is also why sometimes these projects, the project proponent can say the community is abusing their right, they're just not in my backyard, they don't want it here. But part of being involved in the process still raises those issues that still allows the government to make a decision whether to approve the project based in the national interest or the regional interest, but at least they're doing so based on good principles and good information and hopefully good mitigation to take into account those issues and respond to them. So I think there is always that capacity under the significant impact test for communities to ask the relevant authorities to require an environmental impact assessment or some form of environmental assessment. And then if those health impacts or environmental impacts are significant or are likely to be significant, that would then trigger the full environmental impact assessment. But if those impacts are able to be managed through effective management plans and effective agreement, then or changing technology, for example, then it may not need the full EIA. But you've at least addressed those genuine fears from the community.
Okay, we have one more written question. I'm trying to get through the written questions to open the floor to people who want to ask a question verbally, but let's get through perhaps the last written question from Panasok, who's National Advisor to the Regional Technical Working Group. He says, to my understanding, public participation can occur effectively if the government has a strong commitment to mandate the process. In the absence of such a commitment, how can public participation take place effectively? Do you have any examples of that?
That's a very good question, and the reason why I'm laughing, because at the moment in Australia we're having this argument as to whether or not the government even in Australia has a genuine commitment to public participation in environmental impact assessment. A number of large coal mines being approved. I think it's fair to say that effective public participation does require a commitment on behalf of the government, and without that commitment it is very difficult. But yet the experience that I've seen in China in particular is that as people are becoming more aware of the environmental and social consequences of large developments or particular hazardous developments, they're starting to protest, and very strong protest. And so I think governments here can be persuaded that, leaving aside their legal obligations, one strong advantage of early engagement and early public participation in the EIA process is that it helps to remove that potential for conflict. We do need to ensure that we work with government, as well as project proponents, as well as EIA consultants, as well as NGOs, to demonstrate that there are significant values from that public participation. And when Pat, together with the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business in Myanmar, organised a private sector workshop that I attended, none of the private sector, none of the EIA consultants or the project proponents there, none of them rejected the idea of public participation. All of them recognised that public participation during their EIA assessment process benefited them because it helped identify the issues that could be resolved. And that's quite a powerful thing to be able to say to the government, look, your industry, your private sector want this, or the good companies want this. Let's have that genuine commitment to EIA and public participation. The difficulty is always that those companies that are not good companies, and companies that will have environmental and social consequences, they're the ones that try and not comply with the law. They're the companies also that don't really have that genuine commitment to any abiding by any of their conditions. They're also the ones that you don't want building their projects. You want to attract the good companies that are going to comply with the law, not the companies that are going to not comply with the law and not be concerned about community or environmental impact. But it's a very good question, and I thank you for that.
Okay, that's the end of the written questions. Now, because we do believe in inclusive processes as part of public participation, we would like to offer the opportunity to ask some additional questions simply by raising your hand with the symbol on the right-hand side. And we'll then everyone will hear your question, and then Matthew can respond.
Candy, you may speak.
Hello, is it Candy turn? Because we are all together.
Please go ahead, Wong.
Okay, good. I mean, just really to share what is about the what's the question about the percentage of the community engagement in the EIA or public participation. I mean, just share, for example, during the private sector meeting in Bangkok on the 25th of April, the private sector, I mean, project proponent and also the ONEP of Thailand raised similar sort of question about the percentage. And to me, the percentage or the number of representative or community is just only indicative figure, because from the meeting we discussed, and it really depends on the content of the discussion. What is the percentage represent or the number represent? If it can be one way of the process, for example, attend meeting or just receive information as a leaflet or the information of the project just at the level of info. But if it go to the higher level, to the collaborative level, it would be high, for example, to the consensus level of the community. So what form of that number? If that number, that percentage, it represents as, for example, a consensus, that is very important, go to the higher level of public participation. And interestingly, from the ONEP experience, they not really consider only the number or percentage of the representative of the community, but also they consider what is the substance of that kind of or important content of that discussion, and how the project proponent address that issue. And the second thing, in relation to that as well, the ONEP shared experience, they consider the minority voice as important. So they have to look carefully what is those minority voice want to, concern or need from that development project. So this very important. It's not about the percentage, but how this percentage represent in terms of process. Secondly, what it does mean in terms of content of that percentage, how it can happen, and also the decision in terms of based on the minority voice of the community as well. So that's what happened in the private sector meeting in Bangkok last week. That's it from my side. Just share with you.
Next question. Hang, you may speak.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thanks so much for your great presentation. I'd like to ask about how to include climate change in EIA process.
I think that is the subject of a further webinar. I think that's a really good question about climate change, because there are so many issues. There's that question of the impact on the community, the impact of the development, either causing or being subject, disaster management. There are so many issues about that, and I think, and it's also this idea about how you communicate very technical information to vulnerable communities. Dr. Peter, I put it to you that I think that would be a really interesting subject for a further webinar.
Yeah, it sounds like a great idea. It's not just the impact of the project on the climate change, it's also the impact of climate change on the project. So there are two dimensions to this, and clearly some of the techniques that are being developed for assessing climate change impacts, like vulnerability assessments, have a very strong public participation aspect to it. So let's put that on the agenda for the next webinar in the series. So thank you very much for that question.
Kun Chanagot, you may speak now.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you.
My question is about, because we realize that at each step of the EIA process, we need to have a different type of different level of participation. So at each level, it requires probably different techniques. So my question would be, some techniques might not be familiar with our work. For example, like the deliberative polling. So my question would be, in the guideline, should we try to address what is the good practice of each technique, and so that the people who read and probably need to use this guideline can trying to find the best way to do each technique. That's kind of my key concern.
Thank you very much, Kun Chanagod. I think that's a very good idea. That for some of the techniques, like workshops and it could be surveys, or it could be small group sessions. How we do that, you know, as an example, because clearly, as things develop in a project, and this is one of the ideas, that if someone comes with their EIA and their management plan, and they said, here's a workshop on the management plan, but the community have never seen it before or thought about it, it can be very difficult. So that's why the aim of the process of EIA and involved public participation is that you can start off with inform, and then as the project or as the EIA process develops, you get more involved and the community gets more involved with the project and with the feedback and involvement with perhaps the consultant or part of even just looking at things like creating grievance mechanisms or complaints mechanisms as for that ongoing management of the project. So I think that idea of being a bit more, trying to identify some best practice or good practice with each of these methods is quite good.
If I could just add to that, Matthew, I think one way we may be able to do this is to have like an e-book version of the guidelines, where there are hot links to the different techniques, because there are many sort of guidebooks and things like that on how to actually implement each of these techniques. I don't think we need to replicate all of that in the guidelines, but if we could have a hot link to the different tools and techniques, then I think that would be a really good way of doing it.
And I think just from that also is that understanding that you know, America has a very strong culture of community participation and public participation, but it's a culture that is also can be very confrontational. You know, people making strong statements. In different countries here, we might prefer to sort of say, well, you know, you have your initial meeting of inform, then you have a break, and the community can go away and have a meeting themselves before they have to respond. I mean, a lot of my work with Indigenous communities in Australia who did operate on consensus, but once something had been presented to them, then the presenters or the project proponents or the EIA consultants would leave, and the Indigenous people would have their own meetings. That meant the women might have their own separate meeting, the men have a separate meeting, and then they'd come back for a community meeting to try and achieve a consensus position. And that's something that we also need to recognise, in particular the involvement of women in public participation, that there has to be techniques to promote, support and ensure that women do have that opportunity to be involved, because often if you're just consulting, you just go to the village headman and say, do you support this project? The person may say yes, the headman might support it, but how do we know he's consulted with his community or and other people? So I think it's very important to identify those techniques and the issues around each of those techniques.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. Unfortunately, our time is pretty much up. I think there were some additional questions which people would have liked to have asked but have not had an opportunity. If you'd like to send those in as emails to Concerto, we'll make sure that Matthew provides a response to those, or I will try and provide a response. But before we leave, there are two poll questions which we would like you to answer. It's up on the screen now. The first of these is, do you think the public participation spectrum, which Matthew introduced, is relevant to EIA in Asia? And you can select one, yes, no, or maybe. Okay, we have 91% says yes. So I think that's a resounding yes. 92 now. So can we go to the next question, perhaps? Okay, the next question is, which is the most important stage where public participation is required in the EIA process? Screening, scoping, conducting and preparation of the EIA, review of EIA, or decision making? Go ahead and give your selection. Just one. Okay, thank you very much for doing that. As soon as the 100% is in, we'll send out the results of the polling as well. But for me, I'd just like to personally thank Matthew for excellent presentation and answering all the difficult questions. And thank you all to the participants. It's been a terrific opportunity to share information on public participation in EIA. Matthew, any final words from you?
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. I must say it's the first webinar that I've actually been involved in, and I'm very pleased with the questions and the issues that were raised, so thank you all very much, and thank you Dr. Peter and Chocho for organising today. So.
Okay, thank you, and we will get Matthew's presentation up on the website, and Chocho will be in touch with everyone in relation to the questions that were asked as well. And I guess stay posted for the next exciting webinar, which sounds like it might be on climate change in EIA. So thank you all very much, and bye for now.